In Eurasia, cultural differences are usually framed in terms of nationality and ethnicity, not in terms of race. Race and racism are presented as a product of Western cultures, foreign to the Russian and Eurasian world. The absence of the concept of race in the Russian and Eurasian discourse leads to the highly problematic situation where anti-race work that desperately needs to be engaged meets a glaring silence. Because race is not really about skin color or any other visible or genetic difference. Instead, it's a concept that engages power differentials, hierarchy, and privilege. In this video, we discuss how race and racism can be understood in today's Russia and through what mechanisms they are visible.
To express belonging to the nation, the Russian language uses two disassociated terms. Civic identity is encapsulated by the terms Rossiyskiy in Russia or Kazakhstani in Kazakhstan, which refers to membership in a political community, or simply citizenship in a multi-ethnic, multi-racial country. Ethnic identity, captured by labels Ruski or Kazakh, is most often framed as a matter of long-standing historical, cultural, and sometimes, but not systematically, biological ties. This semantic difference largely overlaps with the classic division between a civic, or inclusive, or good nationalism and an ethnic nationalism, exclusive, bad, and, in many ways, similar to a racialized idea of a nation with exclusive and not inclusive features. Of course, these concepts of civic and ethnic are oversimplifications. They're concepts scholars use to try and understand the world, though in reality, the world is much more complex. Today, most modern studies of nationalism and identity consider race and ethnicity to be social constructs. Yet the idea that they feel natural or primordial is an idea that is difficult to get rid of. In the current international system of sovereign states, ethnic and national groups seem natural because of what can be called methodological nationalism, or the idea that we treat nation-states or the boundaries on a map as givens, as if the natural and social world couldn't possibly be organized in a different way. Whether race is seen as a biological or social contract, the function of racism is the same. It is an othering discourse that identifies a good category that we belong to and bad categories that are not us. This othering can lead to discrimination, hatred, and even violence. Racism occurs when privileges for an in-group are institutionalized in a way that protects them from outgroups and then systematically keeps outgroups disadvantaged. Let's now look at several examples of race relations and, in some cases, racism in Putin's Russia. First is the situation of labor migrants in Russia, most of whom come from Central Asian countries, such as Tajikistan, Pakistan, and Kyrgyzstan. In big cities, migrants who work in construction and service jobs become a visible other, associated in the media realm and the public opinion, sometimes with crime, radical Islamism, or even terrorism, or at the very least, just considered not ours. Migrants from abroad are sometimes seen as the same as migrants from Russia's regions, especially if they have physical characteristics of non-Slavic origin. Both groups are often called black, along with a large number of insulting slurs, and face discrimination and harassment in the housing market and everyday life. In this sense, racial logics are at work even if the vast majority of the population never explicitly thinks of race. Another example is related to soldiers fighting in Russia's war on Ukraine. Not only did the Russian government change its citizenship law, offering migrants simplified access to citizenship in exchange for military service, but the country's ethnic minorities very quickly became overrepresented in the casualty lists. Asian Russians from Buryatia and Yakutia-Sakha, and Caucasians from Chechnya and Dagestan have been sent to the front in higher percentages than Slavic soldiers. In the early months of the war, when Russia was relying on its existing professional military, the consequences were disproportionately paid by minorities. One debate that has arisen about the deaths of these soldiers is whether the foundational issue is that minority soldiers are racialized or that they are simply poor and from rural regions. Activists were indeed quick to point out how marginalization of ethnic minorities in the regions leads them to seek military service as one among few stable careers. To understand Russia's ethnic federal system, the concept of intersectionality helps us to see that poverty and minority status can act as a double disadvantage. If ethnic republics do not have the same resources as rich regions, there is already a systemic marginalization that has racial contours. Whether there is purposeful targeting of ethnic minorities, or instead racialized results are a product of systemic and institutionalized factors, those minorities who live in underdeveloped or resource-poor regions far from Moscow face multiple layers of structural disadvantage. Not everyone would agree that ethnic discrimination is racism. Again, because in the Soviet period, racism was seen as a Western problem. Recognizing power, hierarchy, and discrimination as race is a framing that has only recently started gaining ground. Russia's invasion of Ukraine provoked a decolonial movement throughout Eurasian space that has worked to highlight and confront how Russia and Russians have institutionalized their privilege through colonial and imperial practices. As a result of these efforts among scholars and in popular discussions, framing differences in racial terms has become more normalized. This is particularly true in the countries of Central Asia and in the Asian parts of Russia. At the root of these critiques of Russian imperialism and colonialism is the idea that the Russian Slav was established as the norm, and all other groups were relegated to the category of other, those not fitting the cultural norm. The Slavic norm became institutionalized throughout history into dominant practices of Russian language, in the cultural and artistic realm, through standardized education including history, and in political leadership. In the post-Soviet period, some of these norms have remained, even outside of Russia. The continued dominance of Russian literature, cinema, and art, for example, throughout the Russian-speaking world, comes at the expense of creative endeavors that center the non-Slavic experience. Decolonial movements and activists seek to upset the established Slavic norm by calling out the unacknowledged privilege Russia and Russians assume in their relationship with other nationalities and ethnicities in Eurasia.
The salience of hierarchical and racialized thinking became a central point of debate, also in the countries neighboring Russia. After the fall 2022 partial mobilization in Russia, many Russian migrants went to Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. They found a sometimes ambivalent welcome. Practically overnight, migrants became visible in major cities, speaking Russian in many spaces where the presence of Russian language had been decreasing or meeting increased scrutiny as a way to mark distance from Russia and the Russian world. Would Russians be willing to confront their white privilege, or would these racialized hierarchies once again produce a colonizing effect? Would Russians be privileged in the labor market of receiving countries because of their superior education from Russia? Would Russians respect locals or see them as backward and underdeveloped? Would Russians be willing to learn local languages, or would they insist on speaking Russian? These questions hung in the air as the wave of migration proceeded. With blurry lines between race and ethnicity in Eurasia, it can be difficult to move towards inclusive societies. Kazakhstan provides an interesting work in progress on this note. During the Nazarbayev presidency, from independence until 2019, the word Kazakh was used to denote ethnic belonging, while Kazakhstani or Kazakhstanцы was meant to refer to citizenship. Today, the Tokayev government is working to shift the terminology, pushing for Kazakh to refer to all people in Kazakhstan, Kazakh Russians, Kazakh Germans, Kazakh Uyghur, etc. Can a previously closed category now be opened up to inclusively refer to all ethnicities and groups? Time will tell. The political context matters, and Eurasian countries face many challenges on that front. How do previously marginalized and discriminated groups respond to inclusivity once they're the ones in power? The complexity of creating inclusive societies after experiences of empire, colonialism, and often in the context of ongoing authoritarianism remains a key challenge for many countries in the Eurasian region.